The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1887. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the cracked earth, and the only sounds that broke the oppressive silence were the distant hammering from the Blackstone mine and the occasional whinny of horses tied to hitching posts along Main Street. This was a place where fortunes were made and lost in the span of a heartbeat, where desperate men came seeking their piece of the American dream, and where the line between survival and destruction was as thin as the silver veins running through the mountainside. In this unforgiving landscape, 3 men were about to face a moment that would change their lives forever, setting in motion a chain of events that would reveal secrets buried deeper than any mine shaft and expose truths more valuable than all the precious metals hidden beneath the desert floor. What happened in the depths of that mine on that fateful Tuesday morning would shake the very foundations of Copper Ridge, and by the time the dust settled, nothing would ever be the same again. The story begins with Thomas McKinnon, a weathered miner whose calloused hands told the story of 20 years spent underground. His face, lined with premature wrinkles from years of squinting in dim lamplight, bore the marks of a man who had seen too much hardship and too little reward. Standing barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulders broad from swinging pickaxes and hauling or cars, Thomas was the kind of man others instinctively trusted. His steel-gray eyes held a quiet intelligence that most overlooked, mistaking his humble demeanor for simple-mindedness. What they didn't know was that Thomas McKinnon carried secrets that could topple empires and destroy lives. Every morning at precisely 5:30, he would walk the same dusty path from his modest cabin on the outskirts of town to the mine entrance, his metal lunch pail clanking softly against his leg. The other miners respected him not because he was the strongest or the most skilled, but because he possessed something rare in these parts, an unwavering moral compass that pointed true north regardless of the circumstances. His reputation for honesty had earned him the trust of both management and workers, making him an unofficial mediator in disputes and a confidant to men who had no one else to turn to. But Thomas harbored a secret that gnawed at his conscience like acid eating through metal. 20 years ago, he had been more than just a simple miner. His real name wasn't Thomas McKinnon at all, and the past he had buried beneath layers of assumed identity and carefully constructed lies was about to claw its way to the surface like a creature awakened from a long slumber. On this particular morning, as he descended into the earth alongside his fellow miners Jake Sullivan and Pete Morrison, Thomas had no idea that the events of the next few hours would force him to confront the ghosts he had spent 2 decades running from. The mine shaft plunged 300 feet straight down before branching off into a maze of tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the Arizona desert. The Blackstone mine was one of the most productive silver operations in the territory, but it was also one of the most dangerous. Cave-ins were common, poisonous gases could accumulate without warning, and the constant threat of flooding from underground springs kept even the bravest men on edge. The wooden support beams creaked ominously under the weight of tons of rock and earth above, and more than one miner had met his end when those supports failed. Jake Sullivan, a hot-headed Irishman with a quick temper and an even quicker tongue, had been working the mines for only 3 years but had already earned a reputation as a troublemaker. His red hair and freckled complexion made him stand out among the predominantly dark-haired Mexican and Native American workers, and his tendency to speak his mind regardless of the consequences had gotten him into more fights than he could count. Despite his abrasive personality, Jake was a skilled miner with an almost supernatural ability to read the rock formations and predict where the richest veins of silver could be found. Pete Morrison, on the other hand, was Jake's opposite in almost every way. A soft-spoken man from Ohio who had come west after his farm failed during the drought of 1885, Pete approached his work with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that patience and persistence were more valuable than raw strength or bold talk. His gentle nature and quick smile had made him popular among the other miners, and he often served as a calming influence when tensions ran high. What none of them knew was that Pete carried his own burden of guilt, a secret shame that had driven him to seek anonymity in the harsh wilderness of the Arizona Territory. As the 3 men worked their assigned section of Tunnel 47 that morning, the familiar sounds of picks striking stone and shovels scraping against rock echoed off the narrow walls. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning carbide from their helmet lamps, and conversation was sparse as each man focused on the backbreaking labor that would earn them their meager daily wage. Thomas worked with the steady rhythm of long experience, his pick finding the weak points in the rock face with mechanical precision. Jake attacked the stone with characteristic aggression, as if trying to settle a personal score with the mountain itself. Pete worked more slowly but with greater care, examining each chunk of or before tossing it into the cart that would carry it to the surface. None of them noticed the subtle changes in the rock formation around them, the hairline cracks that were spreading like spider webs through the support structure above their heads. The first sign of trouble came at 10:15 in the morning when a deep rumble shook the tunnel floor beneath their feet. The sound was different from the usual blasting that occurred in other sections of the mine, deeper and more prolonged, like the growl of some massive underground beast stirring from sleep. Thomas immediately stopped working and pressed his ear to the wall, his years of experience telling him that something was seriously wrong. The vibrations he felt through the stone were not the result of controlled explosions or heavy machinery on the surface. They were the warning signs of an imminent cave-in, and they had perhaps minutes before tons of rock and debris came crashing down on their heads. Before he could voice his concerns, a second rumble shook the tunnel, this one strong enough to knock loose chunks of stone from the ceiling. Jake cursed loudly and dove for cover as a piece of granite the size of a man's head crashed to the floor where he had been standing moments before. Pete dropped his shovel and looked around wildly, his eyes wide with the kind of primal fear that comes when a person realizes they may be about to die. Thomas's mind raced as he calculated their options. They were 400 yards from the main shaft and escape to the surface, but the sounds coming from that direction suggested that the cave-in had already begun and might have blocked their primary exit route. There were two other tunnels that connected to their section, but one led deeper into the mine and would be a death trap if the collapse continued, while the other was a narrow maintenance passage that hadn't been used in months and might not even be passable. The rumbling grew louder, and now they could hear the ominous creaking and splintering of wooden support beams beginning to fail under increasing pressure. Dust began raining down from the ceiling in thick clouds, and the carbide flames on their helmets flickered and danced as air pressure fluctuations swept through the tunnel system. Thomas grabbed both men by the shoulders and shouted over the growing noise that they needed to move immediately toward the maintenance tunnel. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see in their faces that they all understood the terrible truth. They were trapped 400 feet underground with thousands of tons of unstable rock above their heads, and their chances of survival were dropping by the second. The maintenance tunnel turned out to be partially blocked by fallen debris from a previous minor cave-in, leaving only a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Thomas went first, using his smaller frame to navigate the tight space while Jake and Pete waited anxiously behind him. On the other side, he found himself in a section of the mine that had been abandoned several years earlier when the silver vein had played out. The tunnel was in poor condition, with rotting support timbers and pools of stagnant water on the floor, but it appeared to be structurally sound and might provide a route to safety. He called back to the others, but when Jake tried to follow him through the narrow opening, his broader shoulders became wedged in the gap between two large boulders. Pete, who had been directly behind Jake, found himself trapped on the wrong side of the debris pile as the sounds of the continuing cave-in grew ever louder and more threatening. Thomas could hear their panicked voices through the rock barrier, but he quickly realized that both men were stuck fast and would need help to escape. Jake's position was particularly precarious because his struggle to free himself had caused additional loose rocks to shift and further narrow the opening. Pete was trapped in what was rapidly becoming a dead end as the main cave-in progressed toward their original work area. The situation was desperate, and Thomas knew that he had only minutes to act before the entire section of tunnel collapsed completely. His first instinct was to run for help, to race through the abandoned tunnels toward what he hoped was another exit and bring back a rescue team. But he also knew that by the time he found help and returned, both men would almost certainly be dead, crushed under tons of fallen rock or suffocated by dust and debris. The alternative was to stay and attempt a rescue on his own, using whatever tools and materials he could find in the abandoned section of the mine. It was a choice between almost certain safety for himself and an extremely dangerous gamble that might result in all three of them dying underground. Thomas McKinnon had spent 20 years running from a moment of moral failure in his past, and now fate had presented him with an opportunity for redemption that he could not ignore. Without hesitation, he began searching the abandoned tunnel for anything that might help him free his trapped colleagues. Among the debris and discarded equipment left behind by previous mining operations, he found a collection of tools that included a small sledgehammer, several iron bars that could serve as levers, and a length of rope that was old but still strong enough to bear a man's weight. Working with desperate efficiency, Thomas began the painstaking process of clearing away the rocks that held Jake trapped in the narrow opening. Each stone had to be carefully removed to prevent further collapse, and more than once he had to throw himself backward as loosened debris crashed down from above. Jake, semi-conscious from the pressure against his chest and the lack of fresh air, could barely help with his own rescue, leaving Thomas to do most of the work while the sounds of destruction grew closer and more immediate. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Thomas managed to create enough space for Jake to squeeze through the opening. The Irishman emerged bloody and bruised, with several broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, but alive and mobile enough to help with Pete's rescue. Pete's situation was more complicated because he was trapped on the far side of the debris pile in a section of tunnel that was rapidly filling with dust and poisonous gases from the main cave-in. The only way to reach him was to create a new opening through the barrier, which would require moving massive stones while working in conditions that were becoming more dangerous by the minute. The air was thick with choking dust that made breathing difficult, and the constant threat of additional cave-ins meant that any loud noise or vibration could trigger a final collapse that would kill them all. Thomas and Jake worked together despite Jake's injuries, using the iron bars as levers to shift the larger rocks and create a gap wide enough for Pete to crawl through. The work was exhausting and terrifying, made worse by the knowledge that every second of delay decreased their chances of escape. Pete's voice, calling to them from the other side of the barrier, grew weaker as the air quality in his section of tunnel continued to deteriorate. When they finally broke through and pulled Pete to safety, all three men were on the verge of collapse from exhaustion, injury, and oxygen. Their shared secret. By making Thomas financially dependent on the mine's success, Blackstone believed he could guarantee that his former partner would have no incentive to reveal the truth about their past. The safety improvements and worker benefits were a more complex form of penance, an attempt to prevent future tragedies that might force him to confront his moral failings once again. But William Blackstone had seriously underestimated the character of the man he was dealing with. Thomas McKinnon had spent 20 years trying to atone for his role in that long-ago robbery, and the weight of his guilt had shaped every decision he had made since that terrible night in Deadwood. The recognition in Blackstone's eyes when they first met had told Thomas that his past had finally caught up with him, but he had chosen to stay in Copper Ridge rather than run again because he was tired of running and because he had begun to hope that he might finally have found a place where he could make some small contribution to the world instead of just taking from it. The cave-in rescue had been the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for his entire adult life, the chance to risk everything for the sake of others and perhaps balance the scales of justice that had been weighted against him for so long. When Blackstone offered him the promotion and partnership, Thomas understood immediately what was really being offered: a bribe to maintain silence and complicity in hiding their shared guilt. For a moment, the temptation was almost overwhelming. Financial security, social respectability, and freedom from the constant fear of discovery were everything he had dreamed of during his years of exile and penance. All he had to do was accept Blackstone's offer and continue living the lie that had defined his existence since he had fled South Dakota all those years ago. But Thomas McKinnon had learned something about himself during those desperate hours in the collapsed mine, something that would make it impossible for him to accept Blackstone's attempt at mutual corruption. When he had chosen to stay and attempt the rescue rather than flee to safety, he had discovered reserves of courage and moral strength that he had not known he possessed. The man who had once run from responsibility and hidden behind assumed identities was gone, replaced by someone who could no longer live with compromise and deception. 3 days after Blackstone's announcement, Thomas walked into the superintendent's office and quietly declined the promotion and profit-sharing arrangement. He informed Blackstone that he would be leaving Copper Ridge within the week and would be traveling to South Dakota to turn himself in to the authorities for his role in the Deadwood robbery. He made it clear that he had no intention of implicating Blackstone in the crime, but that he could no longer carry the burden of his secret guilt and needed to face the consequences of his actions, regardless of how much time had passed. The conversation between the two men was brief and charged with emotions that neither could fully express. Blackstone tried to argue that turning himself in after more than 20 years would serve no purpose except to destroy lives and cause additional suffering for people who had nothing to do with the original crime. He pointed out that the statute of limitations might have expired, that witnesses were probably dead, and that confessing to ancient crimes would not bring back the victims or provide any meaningful form of justice. Thomas listened to these arguments with the patience of someone who had already wrestled with all of these questions and reached his own conclusions. He acknowledged that his decision might seem foolish or pointless to others, but explained that he had finally realized that redemption could not be achieved through good deeds alone. As long as he continued to hide behind a false identity and live a lie, every positive thing he did was tainted by the fundamental dishonesty of his existence. The rescue in the mine had shown him that he was capable of true heroism, but it had also shown him that heroic actions lose their meaning when they are performed by someone who is essentially living as a fictional character. When Thomas left Blackstone's office that day, both men understood that their long, strange relationship was finally ending. Blackstone would continue to operate his mine and live with his guilt, perhaps using his wealth and influence to do some good in the world, but never achieving the kind of redemption that requires complete honesty and acceptance of responsibility. Thomas would return to South Dakota to face whatever consequences awaited him, knowing that he might spend his remaining years in prison but confident that he would at least be spending them as his true self rather than as an elaborate construction designed to hide from the truth. The news of Thomas's departure spread through Copper Ridge quickly, though the full story of why he was leaving remained known only to Blackstone and eventually to Jake Sullivan and Pete Morrison, whom Thomas felt obligated to tell since they had shared the experience that had led to his moral awakening. Jake's reaction was typically blunt and emotional. He argued that Thomas was a fool to throw away a comfortable life for the sake of crimes committed decades ago by a different person in what might as well have been a different lifetime. Pete's response was more thoughtful and complex. He understood Thomas's need for redemption because he carried his own burden of secret shame, though he was not yet ready to follow Thomas's example of complete honesty regardless of the consequences. On Thomas's last night in Copper Ridge, the three men sat in Pete's small cabin and shared a bottle of whiskey while discussing the strange turns their lives had taken since that morning in the mine. Jake, still nursing his injuries from the cave-in, admitted that he had learned something about courage from watching Thomas work to free them from the collapsed tunnel. He had always thought of bravery in terms of physical confrontation and had never considered that the most difficult kind of courage might be the willingness to face the consequences of past mistakes. Pete revealed that he too had been running from something in his past, though his crime was of a different nature and had involved embezzling money from his former employer in Ohio rather than violence or robbery. The conversation that followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced before. A moment of complete honesty between three men who had spent years hiding their true selves from the world. They talked about guilt and redemption, about the weight of secrets and the possibility of forgiveness, about the difference between running from the past and learning from it. By the time the bottle was empty and dawn was breaking over the Arizona desert, all three men had made decisions that would fundamentally change the direction of their lives. Thomas would continue with his plan to return to South Dakota and face the legal consequences of the Deadwood robbery. But he would do so with the knowledge that his actions had inspired others to examine their own relationships with truth and responsibility. Jake would remain in Copper Ridge and accept a promotion to shift foreman, but he would also begin the process of tracking down the families of men who had been injured in mining accidents he had caused through carelessness, and would use his increased earnings to provide them with financial assistance. Pete would eventually follow Thomas's example by returning to Ohio to confess his embezzlement and make restitution to his former employer, but he would wait until he had saved enough money to fully repay what he had stolen. The departure of Thomas McKinnon from Copper Ridge marked the end of one story and the beginning of several others. William Blackstone continued to operate the mine and implement the safety improvements he had promised, though his motivations remained mixed and his relationship with his own guilt remained unresolved. Jake Sullivan became one of the most respected mine foremen in the territory and eventually opened his own small mining operation with a reputation for treating workers fairly and maintaining the highest safety standards. Pete Morrison returned to Ohio 2 years later and not only repaid his former employer but also helped expose a larger embezzlement scheme that had been operated by other employees, ultimately saving the company from bankruptcy. As for Thomas McKinnon himself, The resolution of his story would have to wait for another telling. The important thing was that he had finally learned the difference between running from the past and confronting it, between hiding behind elaborate deceptions and accepting responsibility for one's actions, between performing heroic deeds as a way of avoiding guilt and performing them as an expression of one's true character. The cave-in at the Blackstone mine had lasted only a few hours, but its effects rippled outward through time and space, changing lives and revealing truths that had been buried as deep as any vein of precious metal. In the end, the most valuable thing that came out of that mine was not silver or gold, but the hard-won wisdom that redemption is possible for anyone brave enough to face the truth about themselves and strong enough to accept the consequences of their past actions. The story of what happened in Copper Ridge that summer became legend throughout the Arizona Territory. Though most people who heard it understood only the surface details about a heroic rescue and an unexpected promotion. The deeper truths about guilt and redemption, about the complex relationships between past and present, and about the courage required to live an honest life remained hidden like or in untapped veins, waiting for others to discover them when they were ready to do the hard work of moral excavation. Years later, when old-timers in saloons and mining camps told the story of Thomas MacKinnon and the Blackstone Mine cave-in, they would focus on the dramatic rescue and the mysterious generosity of William Blackstone. But the real story was more complex and more profound than any barroom tale could convey. It was a story about the weight of secrets and the price of redemption, about the difference between heroic actions performed for show and heroic actions that emerge from genuine moral courage. It was a story that reminded anyone willing to listen that the most important battles are often fought not against external enemies but against the compromises and deceptions that we create to protect ourselves from uncomfortable truths about who we really are and what we have done. The winds of change that had swept through Copper Ridge in the aftermath of the mine collapse continued to blow long after Thomas MacKinnon had disappeared over the eastern horizon, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the desert silence like echoes of a conscience finally set free. The town itself seemed different somehow, as if the earth beneath its foundations had shifted during those terrifying hours when the mountain had groaned and split, releasing more than just trapped men from its depths. People walked the dusty streets with a new awareness, a recognition that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that the quiet man working beside you might be carrying burdens and secrets that would humble your understanding of human resilience and moral complexity. William Blackstone found himself in the strange position of having to live with a decision he had never actually made. Thomas's refusal of the promotion and profit-sharing arrangement had left the mine superintendent with a workforce that expected him to follow through on his promised improvements, and a community that had heard his public commitments to worker safety and fair treatment. What had begun as a calculated attempt to buy silence and maintain control had transformed into a binding contract with his own conscience and the people who depended on him for their livelihoods. The irony was not lost on him that his former partner in crime had managed to force him toward redemption even while pursuing his own path to moral reckoning. The safety improvements at the Blackstone mine became a model for mining operations throughout the territory. The new ventilation systems prevented the accumulation of poisonous gases that had killed dozens of miners in other locations. The reinforced support structures and emergency escape routes meant that when cave-ins did occur, as they inevitably would in such dangerous work, fewer men died and more families were spared the devastating loss of their primary breadwinner. The company-funded medical facility treated not only mining injuries but also the various ailments and accidents that plagued a frontier town far from established medical care. Blackstone himself seemed to age rapidly during the months following Thomas's departure, as if the weight of maintaining his public image as a reformed businessman was more exhausting than the years he had spent simply being corrupt. Jake Sullivan threw himself into his new responsibilities as shift foreman with the same intensity he had once brought to barroom brawls and workplace disputes. But the anger that had previously driven him to conflict now fueled his determination to prevent the kind of accidents that carelessness and poor judgment could cause. He instituted training programs for new miners that emphasized safety over speed, and he developed a system of warnings and penalties for workers who took unnecessary risks that could endanger their colleagues. His reputation for hot-headed behavior was gradually replaced by recognition as someone who cared more about getting his men home alive than about meeting production quotas. The families of miners he had wronged through past negligence were initially suspicious when he began appearing at their doors with envelopes of money and awkward apologies. But his persistence and genuine remorse eventually won most of them over. Pete Morrison's transformation was perhaps the most subtle but also the most profound. The gentleman from Ohio began keeping detailed records not only of his work in the mine but also of every dollar he earned and every expense he incurred as he slowly accumulated the funds needed to repay his former employer. His methodical approach to financial restitution became a form of meditation, a daily reminder of his commitment to making things right regardless of how long it might take. He started teaching basic mathematics and bookkeeping to other miners in the evenings, sharing skills that could help them avoid the kind of financial desperation that had driven him to embezzlement in the first place. His quiet dignity and obvious dedication to self-improvement made him a natural leader among the workers, though he consistently refused opportunities for promotion that would have accelerated his savings plan but might have compromised his focus on personal redemption. The three men who had shared that terrifying experience in the collapsed mine remained connected by invisible bonds that transcended their different approaches to dealing with guilt and responsibility. Jake would sometimes find himself standing outside Pete's cabin in the evening, listening to the soft murmur of voices as Pete conducted his informal classes in arithmetic and financial planning. Pete would occasionally visit the mine office where Jake worked on scheduling and safety reports, offering quiet suggestions that helped improve procedures without undermining Jake's authority. Both men found themselves looking eastward whenever they stood on high ground, wondering about Thomas's fate and hoping that his courage in facing the past had been rewarded with some form of peace or at least resolution. News traveled slowly in the Arizona Territory, but eventually word reached Copper Ridge that Thomas McKinnon had indeed turned himself into authorities in Deadwood and had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for his role in the stagecoach robbery. The fact that he had voluntarily confessed to a crime that might never have been solved, and had refused legal representation that might have reduced his sentence, had impressed even the judge who had no choice but to impose punishment according to the law. Prison officials reported that Thomas had become a model prisoner who spent his time teaching literacy to other inmates and working in the prison workshop where he used his mining experience to help design safer equipment for industrial use. His letters to Jake and Pete, smuggled out through sympathetic guards, revealed a man at peace with his decision despite the harsh conditions of frontier incarceration. The story of the Blackstone Mine rescue and its aftermath became one of those legends that grow and change in the telling, but the essential truth at its core remained intact. 3 men had faced a moment of mortal danger together, and in that crucible of fear and desperation, they had discovered reserves of character they had not known they possessed. More importantly, they had learned that redemption was not a destination to be reached but a journey to be undertaken, one that required constant choice and renewed commitment with each passing day. The mine itself continued to produce silver and provide employment for the men of Copper Ridge, but its greatest yield had been the wisdom that even the deepest moral failures could be transformed into sources of strength and compassion for those brave enough to face the darkness of their past and work toward the light of genuine redemption. Years later, when Thomas McKinnon was finally released from prison and made his way back to Arizona Territory, he found a world that had been subtly but permanently changed by the choices made in the aftermath of that long-ago cave-in. William Blackstone had died of a heart attack 2 years earlier, but his will had established a trust fund that continued to support mine safety research and provided assistance to the families of miners killed in industrial accidents. Jake Sullivan had opened his own small mining operation and had become known throughout the territory for his innovative safety procedures and his fair treatment of workers. Pete Morrison had returned to Ohio as planned, made his restitution, and eventually opened a school for the children of immigrant families, using the patience and methodical approach that had served him so well in his personal redemption to help others build better lives for themselves. The cabin where Thomas had lived during his years in Copper Ridge stood empty but maintained, as if the town itself was holding it in trust against his possible return. When he finally did come back, older and marked by his years of imprisonment but somehow lighter in spirit than he had been when he left, the entire community turned out to welcome him home. It was not a celebration exactly, but rather a recognition that the circle of redemption that had begun in the depths of a collapsed mine had finally been completed. Thomas McKinnon had paid his debt to society and to his own conscience, and he was free at last to live as his true self rather than as an elaborate fiction designed to hide from the past. The Blackstone mine eventually played out, as all mines do, but the town of Copper Ridge survived by diversifying into ranching and agriculture. The medical facility that William Blackstone had established continued to serve the community, and the principles of worker safety and fair treatment that had been born from guilt and maintained through determination became so deeply embedded in the local culture that they were simply accepted as the natural way of doing business. Visitors to the town often remarked on the unusual sense of mutual respect and cooperation they observed among people who might be expected to be more competitive and individualistic given the harsh realities of frontier life. Thomas spent his remaining years working as a mine safety inspector for the territorial government, using his hard-won expertise to prevent the kind of accidents that had nearly claimed his life and the lives of his friends. He never married or accumulated significant wealth, but he was respected and even beloved by the miners and their families whose lives he helped protect. When he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his example of courage and redemption. The inscription on his simple headstone read only Thomas McKinnon. He chose truth. But those 4 words captured the essence of a life that had been transformed by the recognition that authentic heroism requires not just brave actions, but the moral courage to face the full truth about oneself and accept responsibility for the consequences of one's choices. The story of the Blackstone Mine rescue became part of the oral history of the American West, passed down through generations of families who understood that the real frontier was not geographic but moral, and that the greatest victories were won not over external enemies but over the fear and selfishness that prevent people from becoming their best selves. In saloons and around campfires, the tale was told and retold, each telling adding new details or interpretations but always preserving the central truth that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of honest self-examination and genuine repentance. The 3 men who had entered that mine as fugitives from their own past had emerged as examples of the transformative power of moral courage, proving that even the deepest shame could be overcome by those brave enough to face it directly and persistent enough to keep working toward forgiveness, both from others and from themselves.